When you are a professional stand-up, the most common question people ask is, what's the best heckle you ever had? The second most common question is whether you're a full-time stand-up or a contributing member of society who does open mics a few times a year. People want to know if they're talking to a bold hobbyist or a true weirdo, and fair enough. It's bad business to puncture popular myths, but I find confirming people's cheerful misapprehensions, even when the misapprehensions benefit me personally, to be total agony. So here we go. In fact, I had to learn to stop correcting people when they claimed my career was doing better than it was. These were people who I wanted to think I was doing well. I mean, what the fuck is wrong with me? Let them think the good thing. As long as it's not something provably false. I mean, you don't want to look like a liar. I'm stressed thinking about it. Anyway, the terrible truth is that 99% of heckles are absolute dogshit. If the public was truly consistently funny, there would be no demand for stand-up. Everyone would just sit around the dinner table being spectacularly witty, like characters in an American sitcom. Every now and then, a comedian will tell an anecdote about a particularly witty audience member or someone out in public, often on a bus. Generally, these stories are outright fiction. The comedian has imagined something witty for a given situation and has contrived to put their own carefully honed words into a random mouth, thereby boosting the perceived funniness of the comment. A filthy insult from someone who spent days writing it is embarrassing, but it's delightful off the cuff from a kindly pensioner. Context is everything, and sometimes comedians make up the context or spice up the disappointing, realistic dialogue that the public provided. Warning signs that the heckle story you are hearing is bullshit are the use of any phrase such as a voice from the back, clear as a bell, quick as a flash, any reference to a precocious child or an eccentric pensioner, or the story taking place in Glasgow or Liverpool, two cities that are, rightly or wrongly, obsessed with their own reputations as citadels of wit. My own experiences of heckles is that they are generally committed by the sort of men who make awkward, ill-judged remarks in WhatsApp groups, or the funniest bloke in the office. Men heckle to prove something about themselves to their social group and to test the comedian. So even if they lose the battle of wits, it was only as part of demonstrating their authority as examiner. They don't generally want to destroy the gig, but they do want to spray their scent on the evening as a whole. Women do sometimes heckle, but are generally doing so because they are sincerely, personally offended by the comedian and wish to destroy them, if not derail the whole show. Ask any comedian if stag do's or hen do's are worse. You will see. Both men and women will also heckle when paralytically drunk, but these are more noises than words, and so are useless for comedic purposes. Trying to be witty in response to a senseless howl is like quoting Oscar Wilde at a barking dog. So, caveats aside, this is the story of the best heckle I have ever had. The year was 2022. The gig was called Comedy Den. It was a small hipster night in the basement of a Bristol craft beer bar, run by the comedian Bert Williamson. I was headlining both evening shows. At the later show, I was on stage at something like 11 o'clock on a Friday, so everyone was quite boozed. Some fans of the podcast I do with Phil Wang were in, and the small basement crowd of about 40 people was friendly and even a little conversational. It's not safe for comedians to admit that sometimes we like a slightly conversational crowd, because only the wrong people take that as encouragement. It's like when a single woman complains that men don't approach women these days. The sort of man who leaps on that suggestion like a hungry toad is not the man she meant. Anyway, the crowd was the good kind of drunk and the good kind of responsive. The two things you need to know for the heckle to make sense. The MC had talked to an audience member who was studying the fall of the Roman Republic and introduced me as a history buff. I had then come on stage and established my nerd credentials by reciting some facts about the fall of the Roman Republic, saying, "You see, I'm just as much of a nerd as you were promised." Secondly, the material I was doing was new material written for my show, Why Can't I Just Enjoy Things? All the material was focused on either my social failures or areas where I did not gel with most people. Immediately prior to the heckle, I had finished a routine about how I didn't see eye to eye on something with an X, and did my best to explain my apparently unusual point of view. Suddenly a man seated to my left piped up, You just sound like me. Now, when someone heckles you, the first thing you need to do is repeat the heckle into the microphone, especially at the larger gigs. There is a good chance the audience didn't hear the heckle, and so anything you say in return, however witty, will not get a laugh, since the audience has no idea what you're replying to. Sneakily, it also gives the comedian a crucial few seconds to think and to look at the heckler for important information, like appearance, age, level of drunkenness, social grouping, level of anger, and so on. It also puts the onus on the heckler to repeat themselves or say another thing that can be responded to. If it sounds like I'm turning comedy into something vaguely scientific, systematized, and slightly manufactured, then God help you if you ever read about magic shows. What was that? You're saying I just sound like you? I shot back, wittily, quick as a flash, etc. Well, I have Asperger's, and you just sound like me. I don't think he shrugged physically, but this heckle was certainly delivered with an implied shrug. The man was not shouting or emotional, but offered this information the way one might tell a colleague that there's an easier route to work. You have Asperger's, and you think I just sound like you, I said. Repetition, my old friend. I was certainly surprised and needed the time. Yeah, he said, nodding calmly. As in, you think I might have it too? I pulled a baffled face and drew some laughs from the tension. Yeah, maybe. Why? I was genuinely interested now, but I was trying to hide that from the audience. It can make you look distracted or overly affected by the heckle. Well, you knew all that stuff about the fall of the Roman Republic. That can't be the only criteria for Asperger's. I'm sure that's not the only question on the form. Do you like history? I mimed a doctor ticking a single box on a form. Well, then I've got some news. A decent enough laugh from that to switch back to addressing the rest of the crowd and bring everyone back into listening mode. I've been heckled many times in my career, but never this medically specifically. Decent enough laugh. I moved back into pre-existing material, and thus the gig was broadly back on track. I had felt the crowd grow wary during my interaction with the man. This was partly because there was no clear moral high ground. Yes, the man was heckling me that I might have a medical condition, but in fairness, it was a condition that he himself had, and based on my own description of my own mind. Also, I wasn't annoyed, and the man wasn't either, so there was no combativeness, nothing at stake. It was just a sort of unsettling demi-conversation about a sensitive issue conducted in public by accident. The audience may also have been worried about how I would react. Would I be hurt, confused, dismissive, rude, escalatory? I could have ruined the gig by denying his claim so fervently that I made it clear I found the idea of being like him horrifying or awful. But a few good-natured jokes and some vague meta-commentary had us safely out of the woods for the remaining 10 minutes or so of the set. It passed without incident, and afterwards the other acts and I light-heartedly discussed the heckle in the bar upstairs. In all honesty, it was not the first time someone had suggested it. 2 or 3 friends of mine over the decade or so since I left university had put it to me, with varying degrees of gentleness, that I may be on the spectrum in some measurable way. They tended to say these things shortly after they had come to me for some advice, or vented on some life issue or other, and I had, in my opinion logically, helpfully pointed out the shortest route between them and their preferred outcome. This, I have learned, is often a mistake. When most people casually ask you for your advice, they are silently begging you to guess which answer they secretly want and immediately suggest it as the only sane course of action. Upon receiving my unsuitable advice, these friends would balk and suggest that, while logical, my advice was not delivered nicely enough, and perhaps I was on the spectrum. Or simply, God, you're such a robot. You might be wondering, why was this heckle such an important revelation given your apparent years of Spock-like blundering? The distinction is that these friends who found me robotic were often my most emotions-led, impulsive, and touchy-feely friends. People for whom the phrase, "trust your heart," was actual advice. People who would struggle to break up with a serial killer if the killer seemed like he was doing his best to stop. I felt within my rights to think, well, of course I'm robotic compared to you. The difference that night at the gig was that this heckler, well, he was qualified. The man had the damn thing himself. He was recognizing himself in me, something far more profound and meaningful. The next morning, after an impersonal night in a chain hotel, I was on the train from Bristol back to London mulling over the heckle. It had left my confidence in my own normality shaken, but if you'd asked me then and there, I'd still have wagered I fell on the neurotypical end of things. I had been friendly, was friends with, but sometimes see, but not often. The categorization of relationships has always filled me with panic, since other people's expectations sometimes don't match my own, and accidentally wounding a friend by misdescribing your relationship with them is horrifying. Anyway, I had been friends with a guy at school with Asperger's, and I didn't feel kinship with him on that basis, and thinking back during that train journey, I still didn't. I confess I had even taken some of the shorter online spectrum questionnaires in moments of idleness, though no more seriously than I had enjoyed taking online tests for anything from where on the political spectrum am I to flags of the world, and the autism tests had yielded vague and varying results. Unlike online IQ tests, Autistic Spectrum Disorder or ASD questionnaires can be the same ones a medical professional would have you fill out. Results will still be more accurate with the guidance of a qualified professional, but you can glean your place on the spectrum within an acceptable margin of error, in my opinion, if they are the longer and more modern tests. Despite having already taken these tests in my life, I figured I would use the dead time of the train to try again, and came across a website called Embrace Autism, a very useful website scattered with the sort of unsettlingly cheerful cartoons you'd expect to find in a children's hospital. The site hosts many, if not all, of the questionnaires one would use to measure neurodivergence, along with helpful annotations explaining terminology, which questions or concepts are now out of date, and so on. You can easily fill them in online, even if you're drinking a pint of black coffee on a train sat next to a coughing lady. I filled in pretty much all the questionnaires, and when the autistic spectrum ones came back with a high score, I filled them in multiple times with different answers for the borderline questions to achieve an average, and to see the highest to lowest range of score I could achieve without lying. Honestly, at that point, the website should have had a pop-up that said, "Congratulations, only an autist would have this level of dedication to statistical accuracy. Please consult your nearest model railway salesperson." I have to admit I was a little unsettled at this point. How was I scoring this high? I had met quite a few Asperger's or autistic people in my life, and I had never particularly felt that they were all kindred spirits. In fact, I had found some of them deeply frustrating. Besides that, I was a professional comedian with friends and a romantic partner, and all the stereotypes were clear that made me far too sociable to be on the spectrum. Nevertheless, however normally I attempted to answer the questionnaires, I could not score within the normal range without giving false answers. Shit. Well, time to do an enormous amount of research that becomes an obsessive interest over the next few weeks. Then we'll see who has autism. On that train journey, I began reading accounts of late or adult diagnoses, and I found them very relatable. Previously, I had only read accounts by men who were diagnosed sometimes as early as 7, which were completely unrelatable to me. Generally, the late diagnosis accounts that I found more relatable were from women. Due to societal factors like sexism or medical misogyny, women don't generally get early diagnoses, except in more extreme cases. A surprising number of medical professionals still believe that spectrum disorders are more prevalent in boys and will wave away girls on this basis, letting evidence fit their presumptions. For example, if a boy gets obsessed with train schedules, he'll get prodded by medics, but if a girl is obsessed with horses to the same degree, she won't. Girls also have higher social pressure to conform, which leads to better masking, which is hiding your autism through learned behavior. Boys are freer to behave as they like, and so the autistic behavior pops out and can be seen and quantified. Autism has been said to present differently in women even at a physical level in the brain, so much so that male and female autistic brains can be distinguished from each other in a way that non-autistic male and female brains cannot, though this is currently being disputed. We are still unpicking nature from nurture when it comes to neurodivergence, and I recommend reading accounts from people whose demographics don't match your own. I found reading outside my group especially valuable because, as someone who is excellent at masking, or hiding my autism through changing my behavior, certainly good enough to make it in live comedy and avoid diagnosis for 30 years, I related to late-diagnosed female accounts far more. It had never occurred to me that consciously monitoring my body language or facial expression during conversation was unusual, or that most people didn't use tricks to make eye contact easier. Who knew that it was unusual to have spent a lot of time watching people's public behavior and reading articles or books about socializing in order to learn how to do it, like, say, an alien? Pretty much everyone, it turned out, but it was news to me. Suffice to say, I emerged onto the concourse at Paddington Station a shaken man. I arrived home and said to my partner, I think I might be on the spectrum. And she reacted as if I'd just burst in, jabbed my fingers at my chest and said, I think these might be nipples. I would say duh is a concise approximation of her response, and it was, in its own way, reassuring. It's not always the response one wants, though. I'd have been fine with some version of, you, the glowing socialite, the man they banned from the Caribbean for being too relaxed, British eye contact champion 10 years running, fie, nonsense. I'll have any doctor who confirms it struck off. But there you go, we are who we are. Normally, a heckle is followed by a put-down. This heckle was followed by months of introspection, questionnaires, appointments, and eventually a diagnosis. As is often the case with medical issues, especially with matters of mental health or the brain, once you start researching it, you realize how terrifyingly shallow our knowledge is. We know so little about how the brain works and why. We take what little we know and then misapply it using biased, out-of-date or cultural metrics, further distorting the image. Fortunately, for all of us, lots of very clever and motivated people are working on that sort of thing, at least until their funding is cut, so I'll stick to what I do best, communicating with the public in an amusing way. Maybe you chose this audiobook because you never felt you could ask, why can't I just enjoy things, out loud. Maybe you've never asked the question for fear of seeming like a miserable shit, or revealing how measurable a gulf there is between you and the normal majority of people, with their baffling, incomprehensible behavior. Maybe the title reminded you of someone you know. Then again, maybe the question struck you as so bizarre you felt compelled to see what I was on about. I wouldn't force anyone to get a diagnosis, and even if I tried to, there is often a years-long waiting list if you can't afford private care. However, I suspect that far, far more people meet the threshold for autism than we would ever have imagined. It certainly seems likely that there are more of us out there, judging by the unsettled reactions of friends when they hear about my diagnosis and they ponder how much we have in common. Or when I let someone fill in a questionnaire for a laugh and they score high. In some cases even higher than me, to say nothing of the ever-growing trickle of celebrities coming out as diagnosed. I'd love to reach the silent autistic people hiding in plain sight, if only because I can personally attest to how much their lives will improve when they have a good answer to that terrible question that's followed them for as long as they can remember. Why can't I just enjoy things?